She stood under the harsh white lights of a desert gas station, dust clinging to her shoes as Carson drove away without looking back. No apology, no hesitation. Just the quiet humiliation of being left behind in front of strangers who pretended not to watch. Valentina did not run after him. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there, still enough to notice what others would miss. By morning, Carson would discover that abandoning her had cost him more than a marriage. It had cost him everything he believed he controlled. If you believe silence can be stronger than revenge, stay with this story until the end. Tell me where you're watching from and your local time. And if stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing so you never miss the moment truth finally speaks. Valentina Marquez had learned long before that silence was not the absence of strength. It was its refinement. In the early years of her marriage to Carson Hale, people often mistook her quiet for softness. At company dinners, she would sit beside him, composed, attentive, offering just enough conversation to be polite. Carson, by contrast, filled every room he entered. He spoke with the easy confidence of a man who believed success had already proven him right. Red Line Freight Systems had been his proof. To the outside world, Carson Hale was the architect of a rapidly growing logistics company that specialized in high-speed freight coordination across the Southwest. Investors liked his certainty. Clients trusted his decisiveness. Employees feared disappointing him. What they did not see was how much of that certainty depended on things being exactly where he expected them to be. And Valentina in the beginning had been one of those things. She had met Carson years before Red Line became a recognizable name. Back then, the company was a fragile idea, a handful of contracts, and a constant negotiation with cash flow. Valentina had not just supported him emotionally. She had helped build the structure behind his ambition. Her background was not as visible as his, but it was more precise. She had studied financial systems, risk compliance, and internal auditing. Numbers to her were not just values, they were patterns. And patterns, if observed long enough, always told the truth. In those early days, Carson had relied on her instincts. He would ask her to review agreements, to double-check projections, to make sure the numbers aligned with what he was promising. She would sit late into the night cross-referencing spreadsheets, tracing transactions, quietly ensuring that what he was building had a foundation that could hold. But as the company grew, Carson stopped asking. It was not a sudden shift. It came gradually, almost politely at first. He began making decisions without consulting her. Then he started dismissing her input. Eventually, he stopped acknowledging that she had ever been part of the process at all. By the time Red Line Freight Systems secured its first major expansion loan from Harrison Trust Bank, Valentina's role had already been reduced to something unspoken. She was still there. She just wasn't meant to be seen. At public events, Carson introduced her as his wife. Nothing more. No mention of her background. No acknowledgement of her early involvement. It was as if her contribution had dissolved into the success he now wore so comfortably. Valentina never corrected him. She observed. She noticed how Carson's language changed when speaking to investors. The projections became more aggressive. The timelines more optimistic. There were small inconsistencies at first. Slight deviations between what was promised and what was documented. Most people would have let those details pass. Valentina did not. She began keeping copies, not in a way that drew attention, not in a way that suggested suspicion. She simply saved what she already had access to: emails, draft contracts, expense reports, internal memos. She organized them quietly, categorizing by date, by sender, by subject. It was not an act of defiance, it was a habit. Carson, meanwhile, grew more confident. With confidence came impatience. With impatience came a kind of carelessness that only appeared in private. He started speaking to Valentina in the same tone he used with employees who had disappointed him. Short, dismissive, final. You wouldn't understand the scale we're operating at now. It's handled. Just trust me. The words were always simple. But the message beneath them was clear. You are no longer part of this. Valentina did not argue. Instead, she adjusted. She stopped offering unsolicited opinions. She stopped trying to be included in conversations that had already excluded her. From the outside, it looked like withdrawal. In reality, it was recalibration. If she was no longer being asked to verify the numbers, then the numbers would have to speak for themselves. And so she listened to them more carefully. The first irregularity appeared in a quarterly expense summary. It was subtle, a consulting fee that didn't align with any known contractor. The amount was not large enough to trigger concern on its own, but it repeated in intervals that felt intentional. Valentina traced it back through internal approvals. The authorization came from Carson. That by itself was not unusual. He had full executive authority, but the supporting documentation was thin. Vague descriptions, generic deliverables, no measurable output. She saved the file. Weeks later, another pattern emerged. Travel expenses that overlapped with dates Carson had described as client meetings, locations that did not match the company's active contracts, charges that suggested something more personal than professional. She did not confront him. She compared timestamps. Email logs showed Carson sending messages from one city, while expenses were recorded in another. It could have been an error. It could have been misreporting. Or it could have been something else entirely. Valentina did not need to decide immediately. She only needed to continue observing. The name Vanessa Cole, then and Hatitite, appeared for the first time in a forwarded email. It was brief. An attachment request. No explanation, no context. Valentina noted it. She did not search for the name. She did not ask questions. She simply waited. Patterns, she knew, revealed themselves over time. Meanwhile, Carson's behavior at home became more volatile. The success he projected publicly began to strain under pressure. Phone calls grew more frequent. His tone sharpened. He started stepping outside to take conversations he did not want overheard. Once late at night, Valentina passed by his office and heard him speaking in a lower voice than usual. "I said I'd handle it," he told whoever was on the other end. "Just give me until the next quarter." There was a pause. "No, it won't show up if we route it the same way." Valentina kept walking. She did not stop. She did not linger. But she remembered the exact phrasing. The next morning, she checked the previous quarter's routing entries. There it was again. The same consulting fee structure, the same pattern. Now it was no longer an irregularity. It was a system. Valentina did not feel anger in that moment. She felt clarity. Carson believed he was managing perception, that as long as the surface remained intact, the structure beneath could be adjusted, bent, redirected. What he did not account for was someone who understood the structure better than he did. Someone who knew where the pressure points were. And more importantly, someone who had already begun documenting them. Valentina created a separate archive, not on the company system, not anywhere Carson could casually access. She backed up files to a secure cloud account under her own credentials. She duplicated key documents onto an external device. She labeled everything with precise timestamps, emails, bank summaries, expense approvals, call logs, even the small details, especially the small details. Because in financial systems, it was never the largest transaction that told the story. It was the repetition. At dinner one evening, Carson spoke at length about an upcoming expansion, new routes, new partnerships, a projected increase in revenue that would position Redline as a regional leader. Valentina listened. She watched how easily he described a future that depended on variables he was no longer controlling. When he finished, he looked at her expecting agreement. "You've been quiet," he said. "I've been listening," she replied. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's good," he said. "Sometimes that's all that's needed." Valentina returned a small, polite smile. Sometimes she thought listening was exactly what changed everything. The trip had been Carson's idea. He presented it as necessary. A strategic visit. A chance to secure a partnership that would stabilize Red Line freight systems after what he described as a temporary liquidity strain. The phrasing was careful, controlled, designed to sound manageable. Valentina agreed to go without hesitation. Not because she believed the explanation, but because proximity revealed more than distance ever could. They left Los Angeles just after sunrise. The city still quiet beneath a pale sky. Carson drove. He preferred control over small things, especially when larger ones were slipping beyond his reach. The car itself reflected that preference, new, expensive, meticulously maintained. Inside, the air was still. Valentina sat in the passenger seat, hands folded loosely in her lap, watching the road unfold ahead. The city gave way to highway. The highway gave way to open stretches of land where buildings thinned and the horizon widened into something less forgiving. Carson didn't speak for the first hour. When he did, it wasn't conversation. It was commentary. "You know, most people would be grateful," he said, eyes fixed on the road. "They'd understand what this kind of pressure looks like." Valentina turned her head slightly, not enough to meet his gaze fully. Pressure from what she asked. He exhaled through his nose, a sound closer to irritation than amusement. "From running something that actually matters," he said. "From making decisions that affect more than just yourself." Valentina let the silence return before responding. "I've never assumed it didn't matter," she said. Carson tapped his fingers once against the steering wheel. "That's not what I meant," he replied. "You just don't see the scale of it." The words were familiar, variations of the same dismissal he had used before. Valentina did not challenge him. Instead, she watched the way his phone lit up in the center console. A name appeared briefly before the screen dimmed again. Dylan Brooks. Carson reached for the phone without looking, declining the call with a quick swipe. Seconds later, it lit up again. This time, he answered. "Yeah," he said, his tone shifting immediately. More focused, less performative. "I'm on the road." There was a pause as he listened. "No, not yet," he continued. "I told you we're still within the window." Another pause. Valentina turned her gaze back to the road, but her attention sharpened. Carson lowered his voice slightly. "I don't care what they're asking," he said. "We're not restructuring anything until I say so." His grip tightened on the wheel. "No, you don't bring them in," he added. "Not yet." The call ended abruptly. Carson placed the phone back down, his expression unchanged, as if nothing significant had occurred. Valentina waited. He spoke first. "Dylan worries too much," Carson said. "That's his problem." Valentina nodded once. "What is he worried about?" she asked. Carson gave a short, dismissive laugh. "Numbers," he said. "Cash flow timing. It's always timing with him." Timing. Valentina let the words settle. Timing was not random. It was structured, measurable, trackable. And lately, the timing in Red Line's financial reports had not aligned. The road stretched on. Hours passed. The landscape shifted from sparse towns to long, empty distances, where the desert began to take shape. Dry earth, low vegetation, heat rising in waves that distorted the horizon. Carson's phone rang again. This time, the name was different. Vanessa. He hesitated for half a second before answering. "Hey," he said, his voice softer now, almost casual. "Yeah, I'm driving." Valentina did not turn her head. She watched his reflection faintly in the side window. "No, everything's fine," he continued. "Just business stuff." A pause. "I'll be there tomorrow night," he said. "We can talk then." Another pause, longer this time. "No, don't worry about it," he added quietly. "It's handled." He ended the call and set the phone down with deliberate care. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Then Carson cleared his throat. "Client," he said, as if offering clarification. Valentina nodded. "Of course," she replied. Her tone was neutral, accepting, unquestioning. Carson glanced at her briefly, searching for something doubt-suspicion reaction. He found none. That more than anything unsettled him. The silence that followed was different. Not tense, not confrontational. Measured. Valentina shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting her posture. "Which city are we meeting them in?" she asked. "Phoenix," Carson replied. "We'll stop before that tonight." Valentina did not ask for details about the meeting. She already knew enough. Instead, she reviewed what she had observed. Dylan's urgency, Carson's refusal to involve them, Vanessa's call placed in the middle of a financial conversation handled with a completely different tone, and the word timing. She mentally aligned it with the records she had stored. Quarterly reports that showed delayed receivables, consulting fees that appeared just before reporting deadlines, travel expenses that overlapped with unverified client visits. The pattern was not chaotic. It was controlled. Carson was moving money. Not in large, obvious transfers, but in smaller, repeated actions that relied on timing to avoid detection. Valentina did not need confirmation yet. She needed consistency. As the sun climbed higher, the heat intensified. They stopped once for fuel somewhere along the edge of a town that barely registered on the map. Carson handled the payment. Valentina remained in the car, watching the reflection of passing vehicles in the side mirror. When he returned, he seemed more agitated. "Signal out here is terrible," he muttered. "I can't even get a stable connection." Valentina nodded. "That might make things harder," she said. Carson shot her a quick look. "For what?" he asked. "For timing," she replied calmly. The word hung between them. Carson looked back at the road. "It's not an issue," he said. Valentina did not respond. They continued driving. By late afternoon, the sky began to shift into deeper tones. The brightness softened, but the heat remained. The road ahead stretched long and empty, cutting through terrain that offered no distractions. Carson's phone remained quiet now. Too quiet. He checked it repeatedly, tapping the screen, refreshing something Valentina could not see. Each time his expression tightened slightly. Valentina noticed. "Are you expecting something?" she asked. "No," Carson said quickly. Then after a beat, "Just updates." "From Dylan?" she asked. Carson hesitated. Among others, he replied. Valentina turned her gaze forward again. The car moved deeper into the desert. The distance between towns grew longer. Gas stations appeared less frequently. The sense of isolation became more pronounced. Carson's patience began to thin. He adjusted the radio, then turned it off. He shifted in his seat, then stilled. His fingers tapped the wheel in irregular patterns, no longer controlled. Valentina watched without appearing to watch. She understood the moment before it arrived. The point at which pressure, when uncontained, looks for something to release against. Carson glanced at her again. "You've been very quiet," he said. Valentina allowed a small pause before answering. "I've been listening," she said. The same words she had used before? Carson's jaw tightened. To what he asked. Valentina looked out at the vast, empty stretch of desert. "To the timing," she replied. This time, the silence that followed was not neutral. It was the kind that carried weight. Carson said nothing more. But something in the space between them had shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, just enough. The road ahead led to a gas station miles away, barely marked, barely occupied. Carson would pull in there soon. He didn't know yet that the decision he would make in that place, impulsive, controlled, and entirely his own, would connect directly to everything he was trying to contain. Valentina already understood. She did not need to stop him. She only needed to let the pattern complete itself. The gas station appeared almost by accident. A low structure off the highway, its faded signage barely visible until they were already slowing down. 2 pumps. A small convenience store with fluorescent lights that hummed faintly even from the parking lot. Beyond it, nothing but open desert stretching into darkness. Carson pulled in without speaking. The engine idled for a moment before he turned it off. The sudden quiet felt heavier than the drive itself. Valentina unbuckled her seatbelt slowly. She stepped out of the car, the heat still rising from the asphalt, even as the sun dipped lower. The air carried a dry stillness that made every movement feel exposed. Inside the store, a man stood behind the counter. Mid-40s, tired eyes. His name tag read Miguel. He glanced up as the door opened, then back down at the register, accustomed to travelers who passed through without leaving much behind. Valentina moved toward the shelves, her steps unhurried. She didn't take anything immediately. She let the space settle around her. The hum of the lights, the distant sound of a truck passing on the highway, the quiet presence of someone else who was not part of their world. Behind her, the door opened again. Carson entered. His energy was different now, tighter, controlled in a way that suggested he was holding something in place, rather than letting it move naturally. He didn't look at her at first. He walked straight to the counter, placed a card down, and said, "Fill it." Miguel nodded, taking the card without question. Valentina selected a bottle of water, then another. She brought them to the counter, placing them beside Carson's card. He glanced at the items, then at her. "You're not staying long," he said. It wasn't a question. Valentina met his gaze evenly. "I wasn't aware there was a schedule," she replied. Carson exhaled sharply. "There is," he said. "We don't have time for unnecessary stops." Valentina said nothing. Miguel finished processing the payment and handed the card back. Carson took it, his fingers tightening briefly around the edge. "Let's go," he said. Valentina picked up the water but did not move immediately. "I'll be a moment," she said. Carson's expression hardened. For what Valentina held his gaze. "Just a moment," she repeated. The pause that followed was short but decisive. Something in Carson shifted. Not loudly, not visibly to anyone else, but enough. "Fine," he said, his voice colder now. "Take your time." He turned and walked out. Valentina watched him go. She did not rush after him. Instead, she unscrewed one of the bottles and took a small sip. The water was lukewarm, but it grounded her in the present moment. Miguel glanced at her briefly. "You all right?" he asked, his tone casual but observant. Valentina nodded once. "Yes," she said. She did not elaborate. Miguel returned to his register. Outside, the sound of the car engine came back to life. Valentina did not turn toward the door immediately. She took another sip of water. Then she waited. The engine continued to run. Seconds stretched into something longer. Then the sound shifted. The car moved. Valentina set the bottle down on the counter. She stepped toward the door, her pace unchanged. When she reached the threshold, she paused. The car was already at the edge of the lot. No hesitation, no glance in the mirror, no indication that this was anything other than intentional. Valentina watched as Carson's car pulled back onto the highway and disappeared into the fading light. There were no dramatic gestures, no call after him, No visible reaction, just stillness. Behind her, the fluorescent lights continued their quiet hum. Miguel stepped closer to the door, following her line of sight. "Did he just leave?" he asked. Valentina did not turn. "Yes," she said. Miguel frowned slightly. "He'll come back," he said, more out of habit than certainty. Valentina shook her head almost imperceptibly. "No," she replied. She stepped fully outside now, the air cooler as the sun dropped below the horizon. The vastness of the desert settled in around her. No nearby town, no immediate traffic, just distance. She stood there for a moment, letting the reality of the situation align with what she already understood. Carson had not acted impulsively. He had made a decision, a controlled one, to leave her without resources, without transportation, without access to the things he believed she depended on. It was not anger alone. It was calculation. Valentina turned back toward the store. Inside, Miguel was already watching her more carefully now. "You need a ride?" he asked. Valentina stepped back into the light. "Not yet," she said. Miguel leaned slightly against the counter. "Closest town's about 40 miles, he added. "You're not going to find much out here tonight." Valentina nodded. "I understand," she said. She placed the second bottle of water on the counter and slid it toward him. "For the inconvenience," she said. Miguel blinked, surprised. "You don't have to. It's fine," Valentina said gently. He hesitated, then accepted it with a small nod. "Phone's there if you need it," he said, gesturing to the side. Valentina followed his indication. A landline. Simple. Functional. She approached it slowly. Her reflection in the glass behind it caught her attention for a brief moment. Dust on her clothes. Hair slightly displaced from the long drive. No visible panic. No urgency. Just clarity. She picked up the receiver. For a second, she held it without dialing. Not because she didn't know who to call, but because she was choosing the order in which things would unfold. Outside, the last light of day faded into something darker. Valentina dialed the first number. It rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. "Ethan Caldwell," the voice said. Valentina closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "It's Valentina," she said. There was a pause on the other end. Not confusion, recognition. "I was wondering when you'd call," Ethan replied. Valentina looked out toward the empty highway. "It's time," she said. Her tone did not rise. It did not change. But something in it carried finality. Ethan did not ask for explanation. "What do you need?" he asked. Valentina's gaze remained steady. "Activate the review clause," she said, "and notify Harrison Trust." A longer pause followed. "Are you certain?" Ethan asked. "Yes," Valentina said. No hesitation, no second thought. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Understood," he said. "I'll start the process immediately." Valentina nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Thank you," she said. She ended the call. For a moment she stood there with the receiver still in her hand. Then she placed it back on the cradle. Miguel watched from a distance, not intruding. Valentina turned toward him. "I'll need to stay here for a while," she said. Miguel nodded. "You can sit," he said, gesturing toward a small table near the window. Valentina moved to it, setting her remaining bottle of water down. She sat, not as someone waiting to be rescued, but as someone who had already set something in motion. Outside, the desert grew darker. Inside, the lights remained steady. Miles away, Carson continued driving, believing the situation behind him had been resolved. He did not yet understand that the moment he chose to leave her had aligned perfectly with something far larger than his immediate frustration. Valentina rested her hands on the table, still, composed, watching nothing in particular, and yet everything had already begun to shift. Night settled over the desert without ceremony. The last trace of orange faded from the horizon, replaced by a deep, uninterrupted darkness that seemed to absorb sound itself. The gas station lights became the only defined space in miles of open land. Everything beyond their reach dissolved into shadow. Inside, the hum of electricity continued steady and indifferent. Valentina sat at the small table near the window, the bottle of water untouched in front of her. Her posture had not changed since she first sat down. Her hands rested lightly against the surface, fingers relaxed, as if she were simply passing time. But she was not waiting. She was aligning. Miguel moved quietly behind the counter, occasionally glancing in her direction without making it obvious. He had seen all kinds of travelers pass through, but there was something about her stillness that did not match the situation. Most people would have reacted differently. They would have called someone immediately, panicked, explained, tried to fix the moment. Valentina had done none of those things. She had made one call, and then she had stopped. Outside, a truck passed its headlights, sweeping briefly across the windows before disappearing into the night. The sound faded quickly, leaving the same quiet in its place. Valentina reached for her phone. Not the one Carson knew about. The backup. Its screen lit up softly as she unlocked it. No notifications, no missed calls. That was expected. She opened a secure application, one that required more than a simple passcode. Layers of authentication, redundancy, protection. Inside, the files remained exactly as she had left them. Organized, time-stamped, untouched. She scrolled slowly. Expense reports, internal memos, email threads between Carson and Dylan Brooks. Another folder, Vanessa Cole. Valentina opened it briefly. A series of transactions labeled under consulting fees. Dates aligned with Carson's client meetings. Locations that matched neither contracts nor operational routes. Attached documents, leases, travel confirmations. A signature that appeared in multiple places. Not Carson's, Vanessa's. Valentina closed the folder. She did not need to review it again. She had already memorized the pattern. Across the room, Miguel cleared his throat softly. "You hungry?" he asked, not looking directly at her. Valentina glanced up. "No," she said. A small pause. "Thank you." Miguel nodded, accepting the answer without pressing further. He respected boundaries. Valentina returned her attention to the phone. A new message appeared. Ethan Caldwell. She opened it. Process initiated. Harrison Trust notified. Temporary hold placed pending review. Valentina read the message once, then again, not because she needed confirmation, but because she understood what it meant in practical terms. The hold was not a punishment. It was a safeguard. A pause placed on the system to prevent further movement until discrepancies could be examined. For most companies, it would be an inconvenience. For redline freight systems, it would be exposure. Carson had built his structure on timing, on the assumption that as long as funds moved in controlled intervals, no single moment would reveal the full picture. The hold removed that movement. It forced everything to stand still. And when things stood still, patterns became visible. Valentina locked the phone and set it down. Her expression did not change. But internally, something had settled. Not satisfaction, not relief, just alignment between what she knew and what was now beginning to unfold. She leaned back slightly in the chair. Across the glass, her reflection stared back at her. There was no triumph in it, no trace of vindication, only clarity. A second message arrived. Ethan again. Independent audit request filed. Board notification pending. Valentina exhaled slowly. The next steps would not be immediate. They would move through channels. Legal review, financial verification, formal acknowledgement. But they had begun. That was enough. Outside, the temperature dropped as the night deepened. Miguel adjusted the thermostat inside, the small shift barely noticeable, but enough to change the air. "You sure you don't want me to call someone for you?" he asked. Valentina shook her head. "I've already called who I need," she said. Miguel studied her for a moment, then nodded again. "All right," he said. He returned to his work. Valentina reached for the bottle of water, finally taking another sip. The motion was simple, unhurried. Her mind did not drift. It remained precise. She reviewed the sequence. Call placed, clause activated, bank notified, audit initiated. Each step connected, each step irreversible. Somewhere Carson was still driving, still believing that leaving her behind had simplified something, that he had removed a complication, that whatever tension had built between them could be discarded as easily as he had discarded her presence. Valentina did not imagine his reaction. She did not need to. She understood the system he was now re-entering. By morning, he would arrive at the office. He would expect continuity, access, movement. Instead, he would find resistance, questions, delays. At first, he would assume error, then interference. Only later would he begin to recognize the structure beneath those interruptions, and by then the process would already be too far along to reverse. Valentina rested her hands on the table again. Still, composed, not waiting. Across the room, Miguel flipped the sign on the door from open to late hours. Fewer customers would come now. The space would grow quieter. The hum of the lights seemed louder in the absence of movement. Valentina closed her eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, in focus. When she opened them again, nothing had changed externally. But internally, everything had aligned. Another truck passed outside slower this time. Its engine noise lingered longer before fading into the distance. Miguel walked over with a small object in his hand. A blanket, he said, placing it gently on the back of the chair across from her. "Gets cold later." Valentina looked at it, then at him. "Thank you," she said. Miguel shrugged lightly. "No trouble." He returned to the counter. Valentina did not immediately reach for the blanket. She let it remain where it was, a gesture offered, not required. She appreciated it without needing it. Her attention shifted back to the window. The desert beyond it remained unchanged, dark, still, indifferent. And yet within that stillness, movement had already begun. Not visible, not loud, but structured, precise. Miles away, data was being frozen. Accounts flagged, notifications sent, people alerted. The system, once fluid under Carson's control, was now responding to something he had overlooked. A clause, a signature, a detail he had assumed no longer mattered. Valentina leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms on the table. Her gaze remained steady. She did not smile. She did not speak, because there was nothing left to initiate, only to allow. The night continued around her, quiet and uninterrupted, and somewhere beyond the darkness, consequences were beginning to take shape. Morning arrived without softness. The desert did not ease into light. It shifted from darkness to exposure in a matter of minutes, as if the sun had decided there was nothing worth hiding. By the time the first customers passed through the gas station, the sky was already pale and unforgiving. Valentina had not slept. She had rested, eyes closed at intervals, her body still, her breathing even. The blanket Miguel offered remained folded beside her, untouched, through most of the night. When the temperature dropped, she had placed it over her shoulders without ceremony, then removed it again as the air warmed. She rose before sunrise, not out of urgency, out of alignment. Miguel was already awake, standing behind the counter with a paper cup of coffee. He nodded when he saw her. You made it through the night, he said. Valentina returned the nod. Yes. He hesitated, then added, You figure out your next step. Valentina glanced toward the door where the early light began to stretch across the lot. I did, she said. Miguel didn't ask for details. Good, he replied. Valentina picked up her phone. Still no missed calls from Carson. That too was expected. She opened her messages. A new update from Ethan Caldwell had arrived, while the sky was still dark. Primary accounts frozen. Harrison Trust escalated to internal review. Board alerted. Valentina read it once. The words were simple procedural, but she understood the implications. Primary accounts frozen meant that Redline Freight Systems could not access operational funds. Payroll, fuel contracts, supplier payments, all of it now subject to review. Escalated to internal review meant that Harrison Trust Bank had moved beyond surface verification. They were examining underlying transactions. Board alerted meant that Carson was no longer the sole voice controlling the narrative. The system had shifted. Valentina locked the phone and slipped it into her bag. Outside, the first truck of the morning pulled in its engine loud against the quiet. Miguel moved to assist the driver, leaving Valentina momentarily alone. She stepped outside. The air was already warming, though the sun had only just cleared the horizon. The vastness of the desert remained unchanged, but in daylight it felt less distant and more exposed. Valentina stood at the edge of the lot. She did not look down the road Carson had taken. She looked forward. Somewhere miles away, he was approaching the office. The timing was precise. He would arrive expecting continuity, routine, control. Instead, he would find interruption. Carson Hale entered the Redline Freight Systems headquarters just after 8:30. The building stood in a glass-lined business park outside Phoenix. Clean, modern, designed to reflect stability. He walked in with his usual pace controlled and confident, his phone already in his hand as he reviewed messages. There were more than usual. Notifications, emails, missed calls. From Dylan Brooks. From Harrison Trust Bank. From an unfamiliar internal extension. Carson frowned slightly but did not slow down. Morning, he said to the receptionist without looking up. She hesitated before responding. Good morning, she replied, her tone slightly off. Carson did not register it. He moved toward his office, swiping his access card against the reader. The light blinked red. He paused, swiped again. Red. A small irritation surfaced. He tried once more, slower this time. Red. Carson exhaled sharply and turned. Can you check this? He called toward the front desk. The receptionist stood uncertain. I think I was updating access permissions this morning, she said. Carson's jaw tightened. Without notifying me, he asked. I'm not sure, she replied. Carson stepped back, pulling out his phone. He dialed Dylan Brooks. The call connected immediately. Finally, Carson said, What's going on with the system? My access isn't working. Dylan's voice came through strained. Carson, we have a situation. Carson walked toward the conference room, his steps sharper now. What situation? He demanded. The bank, Dylan said. Harrison Trust, they've frozen the primary accounts. Carson stopped. What, everything's on hold, Dylan continued. Operating funds credit lines. They initiated an internal review early this morning. Carson's grip on the phone tightened. That's not possible, he said. We didn't authorize any review. I know, Dylan replied. But it's already in motion. They cited a clause, something about irregular transaction patterns. Carson's mind moved quickly. Then we fix it, he said. We send clarification, documentation. It's not that simple, Dylan said. Carson's tone sharpened. Explain. Dylan hesitated. They've also notified the board, he said. There's a meeting scheduled for 11. Carson felt the first real shift beneath his control. Who authorized that, he asked. I don't know, Dylan said. It came through legal channels, formal notification. Carson's thoughts aligned around one assumption. Competitors, interference, external pressure. He moved again, pacing now. Get me Harrison Trust, he said. Direct line. I already tried, Dylan replied. They're not taking calls. Everything has to go through their review team. Carson exhaled a controlled release of frustration. Fine, he said. Then we prepare. Pull all transaction logs from the last 2 quarters. I want everything ready before that meeting. There was a pause on the line. Carson, Dylan said slowly. What? Carson snapped. They already have the logs. Carson stopped again. What do you mean they requested them directly from our system overnight? Dylan said. Full access. Carson's mind recalibrated. Overnight. That meant before he had even arrived. Before he had known anything was wrong. A timeline formed. Something had triggered the process. Not randomly, not externally. Deliberately. Carson's gaze hardened. Find out who initiated it, he said. Dylan hesitated again. I'm trying, he replied. Carson ended the call without another word. For a moment he stood alone in the hallway. Employees moved around him, quieter than usual. Conversations hushed, eyes shifting when he looked their way. Something had changed. Not visibly, but enough. Carson walked toward the conference room. If the system was pushing back, he would push harder. He had built Redline from nothing. He knew every part of it, every process, every connection. Whatever this was, it could be contained. It had to be. He pulled out his phone again, scrolling through messages. One stood out. From legal. Formal notice financial review initiated under Clause 14B. All inquiries to be directed through designated counsel. Clause 14B. Carson frowned. The wording felt familiar. Distant. Something from the early structure of the company. A detail he had not revisited in years. His expression shifted slightly, just enough to register uncertainty. Miles away, Valentina stepped onto a bus heading toward the nearest city. The movement was quiet, unremarkable. No one on board knew who she was. No one understood the sequence already unfolding. She took a seat near the window, placing her bag beside her. The desert began to pass by again, this time in reverse. Valentina watched it without emotion. Her phone remained still in her hand. No new messages, no calls. That too was part of the process. Things were moving where she did not need to see them. She leaned her head back slightly, eyes open, gaze steady. Carson was now inside the system he believed he controlled. And for the first time, it was no longer responding to him. Valentina did not need to intervene again. Everything that followed would come from what had already been set in motion. The records had never been gathered in a single moment. They had accumulated, quietly, gradually, without announcement, long before the desert, before the frozen accounts. Before Carson felt the first fracture in his control, Valentina had already begun to see the pattern forming. Not as a single act, but as a sequence of decisions that repeated themselves with slight variations, each one small enough to pass unnoticed on its own. She had not labeled it suspicion. She had called it observation. The first archive existed almost by accident. An email thread Carson had forwarded months earlier, asking her to take a quick look at a vendor agreement. By the time she opened it, he had already signed off. The review was no longer needed. The tone of the message had been casual, dismissive of its own urgency. Valentina read it anyway. The vendor name did not align with any active logistics partner. The scope of work was vague. The compensation structure unusually flexible. She saved a copy. Not because she believed it would matter, because she had learned that unclear details rarely remained isolated. From that point forward, the process became deliberate. She created a private system, not complex, but precise. Folders categorized by quarter, subfolders by transaction type, email chains cross-referenced with expense reports, call logs aligned with calendar entries, everything dated, everything indexed. The method was not driven by emotion. It was driven by consistency. Carson, meanwhile, grew more confident in his separation from her. He no longer asked her to review anything. He no longer considered what she might notice. To him, the distance between them was practical. To Valentina, it was access. She was no longer part of the decision-making process, but she still understood the system that processed those decisions. And more importantly, she still had visibility into its outputs. The second irregularity came through the expense summaries. Consulting fees, recurring, moderate in size. Too small to attract attention in executive reports, but too consistent to be random. Valentina traced them back. Each approval originated from Carson's account. Each description was nearly identical. Strategic advisory services. No deliverables attached. No internal follow-up. She matched the dates. They coincided with Carson's travel, not the trips he described publicly, the ones that existed only in partial records. Flights booked under corporate accounts, but never mentioned in meetings. Hotel stays that did not correspond to known client locations. Valentina did not confront him. She added the data to her archive. The third pattern required more time. Call logs. Carson had become more careful with his phone, stepping outside for conversations, lowering his voice when he thought he might be overheard. But systems recorded what people believed they had hidden. Duration, frequency, timing. Valentina did not need content. She needed structure. The number that appeared most often was unregistered in their shared contacts, but it appeared in correlation with the consulting fees. The same days, the same intervals, the same time gaps between transactions. Valentina saved the logs. Weeks later, the name appeared. Vanessa Cole, not introduced, not explained, attached to a forwarded message that Carson had not intended for her. A small oversight. A document request sent to the wrong recipient. Valentina read it once. Then she stored it. She did not search for Vanessa. She did not ask questions. She allowed the name to integrate into the pattern. Over time, the connections became clearer. Payments routed through intermediary accounts. Leases signed under Vanessa's name. Travel itineraries that matched Carson's client visits. It was not hidden well. It was simply distributed. Carson relied on fragmentation, on the assumption that no one would assemble the pieces. Valentina did. She began linking the data. Transaction to email. Email to call log. Call log to travel record. Each connection reinforced the next. Not speculation, verification. The archive grew, not rapidly, steadily. Every new entry strengthened the structure of what she already understood. Carson was moving company funds, not as a single transfer, as a system, a controlled redirection of resources that depended on timing to avoid detection. Valentina identified the intervals, end-of-quarter adjustments, pre-reporting reconciliations, moments when financial summaries were condensed and reviewed at a higher level where detail became abstraction. He operated within those gaps. She documented them. The most important discovery did not come from a large transaction. It came from a delay. A payment that should have cleared within 48 hours remained pending for 5 days. Valentina examined the routing. It had been redirected. Not canceled, not lost, reassigned. She traced it through the internal system. Authorization, Carson Hale. Override flag used, rare, logged. She saved the record. Then she checked the corresponding date. Carson had been out of town. A client meeting. Valentina cross-referenced the location. It matched a lease agreement in Vanessa Cole's name. The pattern was no longer forming. It was established. Valentina did not feel anger. She felt confirmation. She created a separate folder, marked, structured, complete. Inside, she placed only what could be verified beyond interpretation. Emails with explicit instructions, bank records with clear routing paths, call logs with consistent correlation, documents signed, dates aligned. No assumptions, only evidence. At the same time, she began recording. Not continuously, not intrusively. Select moments, conversations where Carson spoke freely, when he believed he was unobserved, when his tone shifted from performance to intention. One recording stood out. Late evening, his office door partially closed, Valentina passing by without stopping. "I told you," Carson said into the phone. "We just move it the same way. It clears before anyone looks too closely." A pause. "No, it's not a problem," he continued. "By the time the reports are finalized, it's already reconciled." Another pause. "They don't check that level unless something flags." Valentina walked past. She did not pause. But the device in her hand captured the words. She saved the file, labeled by date, time, context, not because it was necessary, because it confirmed what the records already showed. Carson did not believe he was doing something that would be discovered. He believed he was managing visibility. Valentina understood the difference. Visibility could be controlled. Records could not. Over time, the archive reached a point of completion. Not because there was nothing left to add, because there was enough. Enough to establish pattern. Enough to demonstrate intent. Enough to trigger process. Valentina reviewed it once, carefully, not searching for gaps, ensuring there were none. Every element aligned. Every connection supported. No contradictions, no assumptions, only structure. She closed the archive, secured it, backed it up, multiple locations, independent access. She did not act immediately. She waited. Not for more evidence, for the right moment. The moment when activation would not create disruption. It would create consequence. That moment arrived in the desert. Not because of what Carson said, because of what he did. He removed her from the system, physically, deliberately. He believed that distance equaled absence, that leaving her behind meant removing her from whatever came next. Valentina understood the opposite. It created separation, and separation allowed clarity. At the gas station, with nothing but a phone and the archive she had built over months, she made a single call. Not to confront, not to explain, to initiate. Everything that followed did not come from that call alone. It came from everything that had been prepared before it. Carson did not lose control because of one decision. He lost it because every decision he had made was now visible. At once. And visibility, once established, could not be undone. Valentina sat on the bus, watching the desert recede behind her. The archive remained secure, untouched, complete. She did not open it again. She did not need to. Its purpose was no longer to be observed. It was to be examined by those who would see it not as fragments, but as a system, the same way she had. Vanessa Cole did not appear in Red Line Freight Systems as a person. She appeared as a line item. At first, the name carried no weight beyond its repetition. It existed in expense summaries, embedded in consulting fees that were too regular to be incidental, yet too moderate to invite scrutiny. The description never changed. Strategic Advisory Services, The language was intentionally broad, designed to avoid questions. Carson understood how to use ambiguity. He relied on it. Valentina recognized it immediately. She did not search for Vanessa when the name first surfaced. She allowed the records to define the identity. Over time, they did. Payments routed through intermediary accounts, not direct transfers from Redline to Vanessa, but through layered structures that suggested an attempt at distance. The pattern repeated with slight variations, enough to appear unconnected to anyone not looking closely, not enough to withstand sustained attention. Valentina mapped the routes. Each transaction had a starting point, a destination, and a path in between. She followed the path. The intermediary accounts led to a consulting firm registered under a different name. The firm had no public presence, no client portfolio, no operational footprint beyond its bank activity. The activity itself was consistent. Funds entered, funds exited, minimal retention. The destination remained the same. Vanessa Cole. Valentina did not react. She documented. The next layer came from property records. A lease agreement signed under Vanessa's name for an apartment in Phoenix. The rent exceeded what the consulting payments alone would justify. The timeline of the lease aligned with the first appearance of the consulting fees. Valentina cross-referenced the dates, Carson's travel schedule, the expense reports, the call logs. They aligned, not perfectly, precisely. There were no overlaps that contradicted the pattern, no gaps large enough to suggest coincidence. Each piece reinforced the next. Vanessa was not an isolated detail. She was part of the system. Valentina opened the folder again, reviewing the documents with the same measured attention she had given them before. There was no urgency in her movements, no need to rush through information she already understood. She paused at a set of travel confirmations, flights booked under Carson's executive account, destinations listed as client meetings in Phoenix, hotel stays billed to Redline. But the addresses did not match any of Redline's active contracts. They matched the location of the apartment lease. Valentina noted the repetition, not once, multiple times. Carson was not concealing the movement entirely. He was distributing it across categories: travel, consulting, operational expenses. Each one in isolation appeared reasonable. Together, they formed a structure. Valentina saved the confirmations into the archive. Then she opened the call logs. The number associated with Vanessa appeared consistently during these travel periods. Longer calls, late evening, early morning, times that did not align with business operations. Valentina did not need to hear the content. The structure of the communication was enough. She closed the file. Across the city in the Redline office, Dylan Brooks sat in front of his computer staring at the same patterns without the context Valentina had built. He had always trusted Carson. Not completely, but enough. Carson was decisive, assertive, confident in ways Dylan was not. Where Dylan saw variables, Carson saw direction. It had been easier to follow that certainty than to question it, until the accounts froze. Now the system no longer responded the way it had before. Transactions flagged, access restricted, requests denied. Dylan scrolled through the financial logs, his focus narrowing on the consulting fees. They had always been there. He had seen them, approved them, without question, because they came from Carson, because they were labeled within acceptable parameters, because nothing had forced him to look deeper. Now the context had changed. The labels remained the same. The meaning shifted. Dylan opened the details of one transaction: Origin Redline, Freight Systems Operational Account, Destination Intermediary Consulting Firm. He followed the path. The system now under review allowed deeper visibility. The intermediary account transferred the funds within 24 hours. Destination, Vanessa Cole. Dylan's expression tightened. He checked another. Same structure, another, identical. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of realization settling in. This was not a mistake. It was not an isolated misuse. It was a pattern, a controlled redirection of company funds. Dylan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the office felt different, quieter, more distant. Carson entered the room without knocking. "What do you have?" he asked. Dylan turned toward him. There was a hesitation before he answered. "The consulting fees," Dylan said. "They're being flagged." Carson's expression remained steady. "Then we explain them," he replied. "We've used external advisors before." Dylan nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "but not like this." Carson's gaze sharpened. "What does that mean?" Dylan turned the monitor slightly, showing the transaction path. "Funds are being routed through an intermediary account," he said, "then transferred to an individual." Carson stepped closer, his eyes scanning the screen. His jaw tightened. "That's standard structuring," he said. "There's nothing illegal about layered transactions." Dylan did not respond immediately. He clicked on the destination field. The name appeared clearly. Vanessa Cole. The silence in the room shifted. Carson's expression did not change. Not immediately, but something beneath it adjusted. Dylan watched him. "This is what they're reviewing," Dylan said. Carson looked at the screen for a moment longer. Then he straightened. "It's a consulting arrangement," he said. "Nothing more." Dylan held his gaze. "For what services?" he asked. Carson did not answer immediately. The pause was brief, but it existed. "That's not the point," Carson said. "The point is that we can justify it." Dylan leaned back slightly. "They're asking for documentation," he said. "Deliverables, contracts." Carson's eyes flickered just once. "We'll provide them," he replied. Dylan did not argue. He did not need to. The absence of documentation was already visible. Carson turned away from the screen. "This is a distraction," he said. "They're looking for something to justify the hold." Dylan studied him. "Or they already found it," he said quietly. Carson stopped. The words lingered between them. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Carson reached for the edge of the desk, his fingers pressing lightly against the surface. "We're not losing control over this," he said. His tone was firm, controlled. But beneath it there was something new, not fear, awareness. Dylan did not respond, because he understood something Carson had not yet fully accepted. Control was not something you declared. It was something the system either responded to or it did not. And the system had already begun to respond differently. Valentina stepped off the bus in Phoenix just after midday. The city felt structured after the open desert. Defined, contained, predictable in ways the night before had not been. She adjusted the strap of her bag and moved toward the curb. A car waited. Ethan Caldwell stepped out, his posture, composed, his expression unreadable in the way of someone accustomed to dealing with situations that required precision over reaction. "Valentina," he said. She nodded. "Ethan." He opened the door for her. "I've reviewed the initial materials," he said as she entered. "It's thorough." Valentina did not respond immediately. "It needed to be," she said. Ethan closed the door and walked around to the driver's side. As he started the car, he glanced at her briefly. "They're going to ask questions," he said. "I know," Valentina replied. "And they'll try to frame this differently," he added. Valentina looked ahead. "They can try," she said. Ethan nodded once. The car pulled into traffic. Behind them, the desert remained unchanged. Ahead, the system that Carson had built was beginning to reveal itself. Not through confrontation, through structure, through records, through patterns that no longer remained hidden. Valentina sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap. She did not need to speak, because everything that mattered had already been written. The clause Carson had forgotten was not hidden. It had never been buried in obscure language or placed where no one would find it. It existed in the original structure of Red Line Freight Systems, written at a time when the company was fragile enough to require safeguards, when trust was still something that needed reinforcement rather than assumption. Back then, Carson had agreed to it without hesitation. Valentina remembered the moment. They had been sitting at a narrow table, documents spread between them, the future of the company still uncertain enough to demand precision. Carson had been impatient even then, eager to move forward to secure funding to finalize agreements. "It's standard," Ethan Caldwell had said at the time, his voice measured as he reviewed the terms. "A protective clause. If there's ever a question of financial irregularity, it allows for an independent review without requiring full executive consent." Carson had barely looked at it. "Fine," he had said. "If it keeps the investors comfortable." He signed. Valentina signed. And the clause became part of the structure. Clause 14B. At the time, it had been a formality. Now it was function. Ethan pulled the car into an underground parking structure beneath a quiet office building. The transition from daylight to shadow was abrupt but controlled. Everything here felt contained, intentional, designed for work that did not require visibility. Valentina stepped out, her movements steady. "This way," Ethan said. They moved through a secured entrance, up a short corridor, and into a conference room that held none of the excess Carson preferred. No glass walls, no decorative elements. Just a long table, a screen, and a set of documents already arranged in precise order. Ethan closed the door behind them. "They've acknowledged the clause," he said. Harrison Trust initiated the hold within hours of notification. Valentina took a seat. "Expected," she replied. Ethan nodded. "The board has also confirmed an emergency session," he continued. "Carson will be there." Valentina did not react. "Of course," she said. Ethan placed a folder in front of her. "These are the materials they've formally requested," he said. "Transaction summaries, supporting documentation, and any recorded evidence that establishes intent." Valentina opened the folder. The list matched what she had prepared. "Everything is already organized," she said. Ethan allowed a small, almost imperceptible shift in expression. "I noticed," he replied. There was no admiration in his tone, only recognition. Valentina closed the folder again. "When does the review begin?" she asked. "Within the hour," Ethan said. "Preliminary session first. Full presentation after." Valentina nodded once. She did not ask what Carson had said. She did not ask how he was responding. That part of the process no longer required her attention. At Red Line headquarters, the atmosphere had changed. Not dramatically, not visibly to an outside observer. But internally, everything felt narrower, controlled, measured in a way that replaced the previous sense of momentum with something more restrained. Carson stood at the head of the conference room table, his hands resting lightly against the surface. Around him, members of the board took their seats. Some avoided eye contact, others watched him directly, their expressions neutral. Dylan sat to the side, a laptop open in front of him, the screen filled with financial data he had not yet fully processed. The meeting began without introduction. A representative from Harrison Trust appeared on the screen at the far end of the room. "Mr. Hale," the voice said, formal and even, "we appreciate your cooperation during this review." Carson inclined his head slightly. "Of course," he replied. "We're eager to resolve any concerns," the representative continued. "As you've been notified, the review has been initiated under Clause 14B of your corporate agreement. This allows for an independent examination of financial activity where irregular patterns are detected." Carson's expression remained composed. "We're aware of the clause," he said. There was a brief pause. "Good," the representative said. "Then we'll proceed." A series of documents appeared on the screen. Transaction summaries, dates, amounts, routing paths. The structure Valentina had built now displayed in its official form. Carson watched. He did not interrupt. Not yet. These transactions, the representative continued, have been identified as consistent in structure and timing. They originate from your operational accounts and are routed through intermediary entities before reaching an individual recipient. The screen shifted. The name appeared. Vanessa Cole. Carson's gaze remained steady. "We will require clarification regarding the nature of these payments," the representative said. Carson stepped forward slightly. "They are consulting fees," he said, "external advisory services related to strategic expansion." The representative did not respond immediately. "Documentation supporting these services has not been provided," they said. Carson nodded once. "It can be," he replied. Dylan glanced at him. The pause was small, but it existed. The representative continued. "In addition, the frequency and timing of these transactions correspond with reported travel that does not align with documented client engagements." Another set of data appeared. Flight logs, expense reports, location records. The connections drawn clearly. Carson's jaw tightened. "These are preliminary interpretations," he said. "We'll provide context." The representative acknowledged the statement without agreeing. Further, they said the initiation of this review was triggered by a formal request from an authorized party under Clause 14b. Carson's attention sharpened. "Authorized by whom?" he asked. The answer came without hesitation. "Valentina Marquez." The room shifted. Not in movement, in awareness. Dylan's eyes moved toward Carson. Several board members exchanged brief glances. Carson did not move. For a moment, the name existed in the space without reaction. Then he spoke. "That's not relevant," he said. The representative's tone remained unchanged. "It is directly relevant," they replied. "The clause requires activation by a signatory with original authorization. Miss Marquez meets that requirement." Carson's expression remained controlled. "She has no operational role in the company," he said. The representative responded immediately. "Her operational role is not the determining factor. Her status as an original signatory is." The distinction settled, not loudly, but definitively. Carson's gaze hardened slightly. "That clause was never intended to be used this way," he said. The representative paused. "It is being used as written," they replied. The room fell quiet. Dylan looked down at his screen, then back up again. The data remained unchanged, the structure intact. Carson stepped back from the table. Not retreating, recalibrating. "Then we proceed with the review," he said. The representative inclined their head. "That is the purpose of this session," they replied. In the conference room beneath the city, Valentina sat across from Ethan as the preliminary session concluded on their end. "They've acknowledged the activation," Ethan said. Valentina nodded. "And Carson?" she asked. Ethan glanced at his notes. "Maintaining position," he said. "For now." Valentina accepted the answer. She did not ask for more, because she understood the phase they had entered. Denial, containment, reframing. It would not last. Not against structure, not against records. Ethan closed the file in front of him. "The full presentation will begin shortly," he said. "They'll go deeper." Valentina folded her hands on the table. "Good," she replied. There was no satisfaction in her voice, no anticipation, only readiness. The clause had been activated. The system had responded. What followed would not depend on her words. It would depend on what had already been written. and that, unlike anything Carson could say, would not change. Carson had always believed that control began with narrative. Not the kind spoken publicly shaped for investors and press, but the quieter version that lived inside a room. The one that decided what details mattered, which ones could be deferred, and how uncertainty was framed before it had time to solidify into doubt. For years, that narrative had worked. When a contract slipped, he called it strategic delay. When projections missed, he called it recalibration. When expenses rose beyond expectation, he called it temporary expansion pressure. The language shifted, but the structure remained the same. He defined the meaning before anyone else could question it. Now in the conference room, that structure was beginning to resist him. The second phase of the review began without announcement. Additional documents appeared on the screen. Not summaries this time, but full records. Transaction logs expanded to show internal routing paths. Email threads attached as context. Call data layered beside financial movement. The information did not argue. It aligned. The representative from Harrison Trust spoke with the same measured tone. We will now review supporting communications associated with the identified transactions. An email opened. From Carson Hale to Dylan Brooks. Subject: reallocation timing. The message was brief. Move the consulting disbursement through the usual channel. Make sure it clears before reporting cutoff. Carson watched it without reacting. He remembered writing it. At the time, it had felt procedural. Now displayed in sequence with the transaction it referenced, it carried a different weight. That's operational language, Carson said. It refers to vendor payments. The representative acknowledged the statement. Noted, they replied. Another email appeared. From Carson to an intermediary account administrator. Use the same routing. Keep the intervals consistent. Dylan shifted in his seat. Carson did not look at him. The representative continued. These communications correspond directly with the transaction paths previously identified. Carson stepped forward slightly. There's nothing unusual about maintaining consistency in payment structures, he said. It ensures stability. The response came without delay. Consistency is not in question, the representative said. The destination and purpose are. The screen shifted again. Call logs, durations, frequencies, aligned against transaction dates. Then an audio file. The room remained silent as it began to play. Carson's voice filled the space lower than usual, unfiltered by performance. We just move it the same way. It clears before anyone looks too closely. The recording ended. No commentary followed immediately. The absence of reaction carried more weight than any immediate response. Carson's expression did not change. But something in the room did. Not dramatic, not visible in movement, just a recalibration of perception. Dylan looked down at the table. One of the board members leaned back slightly, folding his hands. The representative spoke again. This recording is time-stamped and aligns with the transaction sequence under review. Carson exhaled slowly. That's being taken out of context, he said. The words came smoothly, practiced. But there was a slight delay before them, a fraction of a second that did not exist before. The representative did not challenge the statement directly. Then context will be considered alongside the full record, they replied. Another document appeared. Expense reports, locations, dates, cross-referenced with the lease agreement. Vanessa Cole. The name remained on the screen longer this time. Not emphasized, just present. Carson shifted his stance. Those expenses are legitimate, he said. Travel is part of business operations. Dylan spoke, his voice quieter than usual. They don't match any active contracts, he said. Carson turned toward him. They were exploratory, Carson replied. Preliminary discussions. Dylan held his gaze. With no documentation, he asked. The question was not confrontational. It was factual. Carson did not answer immediately. The pause stretched slightly longer than before. "We'll provide it," he said. The representative's voice remained even. "Documentation requests were issued earlier this morning," they said. "No supporting materials have been submitted." Carson's attention returned to the screen. His mind moved quickly. Options, responses, reframing. "This process is premature," he said. "We've had no opportunity to prepare a complete response." The representative inclined their head slightly. "The clause allows for immediate review upon activation," they replied. "Preparation time is not a requirement." Carson's jaw tightened. He recognized the structure now, not as something external, as something embedded, something he had agreed to, something he had not considered in years. Clause 14b. It had seemed irrelevant. A detail from an earlier stage. Now it was defining the terms of the conversation. Carson stepped back again, his hands no longer resting on the table. For the first time, his posture shifted from assertion to calculation. He needed a different approach. "Then we proceed carefully," he said. "There's a distinction between irregularity and misconduct." The representative acknowledged the statement. "That distinction is part of the review," they said. The screen cleared briefly. Then a new set of records appeared: bank routing confirmations, intermediary account details, final destination logs. Each step displayed in sequence. The structure was no longer abstract. It was visible, complete. Carson watched. He did not interrupt. Not because he agreed, because interruption would not change the alignment. Dylan spoke again more quietly. "I didn't see this," he said. The admission was not directed at Carson. It existed in the space. Carson did not respond. The representative continued. "These patterns indicate a sustained redirection of company funds over multiple reporting periods." Carson's gaze remained fixed on the screen. "We dispute that characterization," he said. The response was immediate. "Your position is noted," the representative replied. Another pause. Then the final element appeared. A summary, not interpretation, compilation, dates, amounts, total value. The number did not need emphasis. It spoke through accumulation. Carson's expression remained controlled. But the structure he relied on was no longer holding in the same way. The narrative had shifted, not because someone argued against him, because the system no longer responded to his framing. It responded to the record. He understood that now, not fully, but enough. He straightened slightly. "We will submit a formal response," he said, "with supporting documentation." The representative inclined their head. "You are welcome to do so," they replied. The phrasing was precise. Permission, not reliance. The review would proceed regardless. The room settled into a different kind of silence, not uncertain, defined. The representative concluded the session. "This phase of the review is complete. Further analysis will continue and additional requests may be issued." The screen went dark. No closing statements, no resolution, just continuation. Carson remained standing for a moment after the call ended. No one spoke. Dylan closed his laptop slowly. The board members gathered their notes without urgency. The absence of immediate reaction felt more significant than confrontation would have. Carson looked around the room. The same people, the same space, but the alignment had changed. Not visibly, structurally. He turned without comment and walked out. Across the city, Valentina sat in the conference room, the same documents open in front of her. Ethan closed his folder. "They've moved through the core materials," he said. Valentina nodded, and she asked. Ethan considered his response. He's maintaining position, he said. But the structure isn't holding the way it did before. Valentina accepted the assessment. She did not ask for detail. She did not need to. She understood the phase. The narrative had begun to fracture, not through confrontation, through alignment. Ethan leaned back slightly. They'll continue, he said. This doesn't end here. Valentina folded her hands. I know, she replied. Her tone remained steady, not anticipatory, not reactive, just aware. Everything that needed to be introduced had been introduced. What followed would not depend on her presence. It would depend on what had already been established. And that once seen could not be unseen. The boardroom did not erupt. There were no raised voices, no accusations thrown across the table, no dramatic collapse of composure. What unfolded instead was quieter, more precise, and far more difficult to contain. By the time the second session began, the room had changed in ways that could not be undone. Seats were the same, names were the same, but alignment had shifted, not visibly, structurally. Carson entered a few minutes early. He preferred it that way. It gave him time to reestablish presence, to occupy the space before others filled it with their own assumptions. He placed his phone on the table, adjusted his jacket, and reviewed the notes he had assembled in the short interval between sessions. Arguments, clarifications, reframes. He had constructed them carefully. Language still mattered. It always had. The board members filed in one by one. Some acknowledged him with brief nods. Others avoided direct eye contact, focusing instead on their materials. Dylan took his seat without speaking, his laptop already open, the glow of the screen reflecting in his glasses. The representative from Harrison Trust reappeared on the screen. This session will address formal findings, the voice said. No introduction, no delay. The structure had moved forward. Carson inclined his head slightly. We're ready, he said. The first document appeared. Not a summary. A consolidated report. All previously reviewed materials compiled into a single sequence. Transaction paths mapped in full. Communications attached. Supporting data layered without interruption. The pattern, once fragmented, now existed as a complete system. The representative continued. Over the course of multiple reporting periods, company funds were consistently redirected through intermediary accounts to a non-operational recipient. The phrasing was deliberate, not emotional, not accusatory, defined. Carson stepped forward slightly. We've already addressed the nature of those payments, he said. They were consulting fees. The representative did not respond immediately. Supporting documentation for those services has not been provided, they said. Carson opened the folder in front of him. We're in the process of compiling it, he replied. The response came without variation. The review does not pause for compilation. A small shift moved through the room. Not movement, recognition. Carson's jaw tightened. He adjusted his stance. Then allow me to clarify, he said. These payments were part of exploratory expansion efforts, early-stage engagements that don't always produce formal deliverables. The representative acknowledged the statement. Exploratory engagements typically produce internal documentation, they said. No such records have been identified. Carson did not respond immediately. The pause was brief, but it existed. Dylan watched it. So did the others. The representative continued. Additionally, the recipient of these funds, Vanessa Cole, does not appear in any formal capacity within the company's operational structure. The name settled into the room. Carson spoke again. She was an external advisor, he said. For which services, the representative asked. The question was simple, direct. Carson's gaze remained steady. Strategic positioning, he said. The words were precise, but they did not expand. The representative paused. Further clarification will be required, they said. The screen shifted. A new element appeared. Bank records, not summaries, original entries, routing confirmations with full authorization trails. Each transaction linked directly to Carson's executive credentials. Override flags highlighted. Rare usage, consistent pattern. Dylan leaned forward slightly. He had seen parts of this, not the entirety, not the alignment. Now it existed in front of him. Complete. The representative spoke again. These transactions required executive-level authorization beyond standard operational thresholds. Carson nodded once. "That's within my authority," he said. The response came immediately. "Authority does not negate review," the representative replied. Carson's gaze hardened slightly. "I'm not disputing the review," he said. "I'm clarifying that these actions were within the scope of my role." The representative paused. "Scope is part of the determination," they said. Another document appeared. Audio transcripts. Not just the single recording previously played. Multiple excerpts. Short, precise. Time-stamped. Carson's voice captured in different moments. "Keep it off the main line. We'll route it the same way. It clears before anyone looks too closely." The words were not dramatic. They were procedural. But placed together, they formed something else. Intent. Carson exhaled slowly. "These are fragments," he said, "without full context." The representative acknowledged the statement. "Full recordings are available for review," they said. No challenge, no escalation, just structure. The room remained quiet. No one interrupted, because interruption would not alter what was already aligned. The next phase began without announcement. Legal counsel for the board spoke for the first time. Under Clause 14b, the counsel said activation requires demonstration of reasonable concern regarding financial irregularity. The threshold for that concern has been met. Carson turned slightly toward the voice. "Reasonable concern is not proof of misconduct," he said. "Correct," counsel replied. "It is the basis for review. The distinction held. Clear, defined." Carson's posture shifted again. Less forward, more measured. He understood now that this was not a space where he could redirect the conversation through language alone. The structure was set, the process independent. He needed to adapt. "Then we proceed with full transparency," he said. "We'll provide every record you require." Counsel inclined their head. "That is expected," they said. Another pause. Then the final element of the session appeared. A timeline. Not individual events, sequence. From initial transaction to present. Each step connected. Each action placed within context. The desert did not appear, but its impact existed within the sequence. A gap. A moment where Valentina's absence aligned with a critical transaction Carson had authorized. The representative spoke. During this period, authorization was executed while the co-signatory listed under Clause 14b was not present. Carson's attention sharpened. "That's not relevant," he said. Counsel responded. "It establishes context," they said, "particularly in relation to subsequent activation of the clause." Carson did not answer. The implication was clear. Not accusation, connection. The session concluded without declaration. No verdict, no final statement, only continuation. "This phase is complete," the representative said. "Further determinations will follow pending full analysis." The screen went dark again. The room remained. Quiet, defined. Dylan closed his laptop. He did not look at Carson. One of the board members gathered his papers, slowly aligning them before standing. No one spoke immediately, because there was nothing left to say that would alter the structure now in place. Carson remained standing, for a moment longer than necessary. Then he stepped back from the table. Not abruptly, deliberately. He understood now that the room no longer responded to him in the same way, not because he had lost authority in a single moment, because authority had shifted into process. And process did not respond to tone. It responded to record. Across the city, Valentina stood by the window of the conference room, looking out over the street below. Traffic moved. People crossed intersections. Life continued without awareness of the structure unfolding behind closed doors. Ethan stood near the table, reviewing final notes. "They've moved into formal alignment," he said. Valentina did not turn. "Yes," she replied. "They'll proceed to determination," he added. Valentina nodded slightly. "I know." Ethan watched her for a moment. "You won't need to be present for the next phase," he said. Valentina turned, then her expression unchanged. "I wasn't planning to be," she replied. There was no hesitation, no need to witness the conclusion. She had already seen the structure that would lead to it. Ethan closed the file. "It will take time," he said. Valentina stepped away from the window. "That's fine," she replied. Time did not change records. It only revealed them. She gathered her bag. No urgency, no delay. Everything that required her action had already been completed. What remained belonged to the system, and the system, once aligned, would continue without her. The gas station had not changed. In the days that followed, it remained what it had always been. A small structure off a long stretch of road. 2 pumps. A convenience store lit by fluorescent lights that did not soften with time. The desert around it continued without interruption, indifferent to what had taken place there. What changed was the meaning attached to it. Not for those who passed through, for those who began to examine it. The request came as part of the next phase, not from Carson, not from the board, from the review team. Clarify the authorization context for transactions executed on the evening of date. The wording was precise. They were not asking where Carson had been. They were asking what conditions existed when he acted. Ethan received the request early that morning. He read it once, then again. Then he looked up at Valentina. "They're expanding the timeline," he said. Valentina nodded. "They will," she replied. Ethan placed the document on the table. "They want confirmation of your location during the authorization window," he said. Valentina's expression did not change. "They already have it," she said. "Partially," Ethan replied, "but they're formalizing it." Valentina understood. Partial information established possibility. Formal documentation established structure. She reached into her bag and removed a small folder. It was thinner than the others, not because it contained less, because it required less interpretation. Inside were 3 elements: a receipt, a timestamp, a record. She placed it on the table. Ethan opened it. The first page was a printed receipt from the gas station. Date, time, location. The amount was minimal. Water, nothing more. The second page was a still image. Security footage. Valentina standing near the counter. The timestamp aligned with the receipt. The third page was a statement. Not hers, Miguel's. Brief, direct. Customer remained on site during the evening hours. No vehicle present after initial departure. Ethan reviewed the documents in silence. Then he looked up. "This places you 40 miles from any network access point tied to the transaction," he said. Valentina nodded. "Yes." Ethan closed the folder, and Carson executed the authorization during that window, he added. Valentina did not respond. She did not need to. The connection was clear, not accusatory, definitive. At Redline, the request arrived mid-morning. Dylan read it before Carson did. He recognized its significance immediately, not because it introduced new information, because it aligned existing information in a way that removed ambiguity. He walked into Carson's office without knocking. "They're asking about that night," Dylan said. Carson looked up from his desk. "What night?" he asked. Dylan placed the document in front of him. "The authorization window," he said. "They want context." Carson glanced at the page. His expression remained controlled. "It's routine," he said. "They're expanding the review." Dylan did not move. "They're connecting it to her," he said. Carson's eyes lifted. "To Valentina," Dylan added. The name settled. Carson leaned back slightly in his chair. "That's irrelevant," he said. Dylan shook his head. "It's not," he replied. "If she wasn't present and you executed the override," Carson cut him off. "I had full authority," he said. Dylan held his gaze. "That's not what they're questioning," he said. The distinction lingered. Carson looked down at the document again. For a moment, he did not speak. Then he reached for his phone. "I'll handle it," he said. Dylan did not respond, because he understood something Carson was still adjusting to. Handling was no longer a function of response. It was a function of structure. And the structure had already begun to close around the timeline. The gas station footage arrived in the review system within hours. Not dramatic, not emphasized, just another entry, another record. But placed within the sequence, it altered the alignment. The representative from Harrison Trust reviewed it alongside the existing materials. Timestamp, location, distance. Then the transaction log. Authorization executed. Override flag used. Time aligned. The co-signatory listed under Clause 14B was not present. The system noted it, not as accusation, as condition. The representative made a brief note. Authorization context confirmed. The phrase carried no emotion, but it removed something. Possibility. The next session began without delay. Carson entered the room with the same controlled pace. But the room did not respond the same way. It had grown quieter, not in volume, in expectation. The representative spoke first. "We've received additional materials relevant to the authorization timeline," they said. Carson inclined his head. "We've also submitted clarifications," he replied. The representative acknowledged the statement. "They will be reviewed," they said. The screen displayed the gas station record. Carson looked at it. For a moment there was no visible reaction. Then his gaze shifted slightly. Recognition, not of the place, of the connection. The representative continued. "This establishes the location of the co-signatory during the transaction window." Carson spoke. "She was not required to be present," he said. The response came immediately. "Presence is not the requirement," the representative replied. "Context is." Carson's jaw tightened. "This is being framed incorrectly," he said. The representative did not respond to the framing. They moved forward. The authorization executed during this period utilized an override function that bypasses standard dual signature protocol. The phrase settled. Not new, but now aligned with location. Carson stepped forward slightly. "That function exists for operational flexibility," he said. The representative nodded. "It does," they replied. A pause. "Then and its use is subject to review when irregular patterns are present." The structure held. Carson looked at the screen again. The image remained unchanged. Valentina standing under fluorescent light. Still, unmoving. The timestamp fixed, the desert visible beyond the glass. A moment that had felt contained, now expanded, connected. Carson exhaled slowly. "That doesn't change the nature of the transactions," he said. The representative did not disagree. "It informs the conditions under which they occurred," they replied. Dylan sat still. He did not look at Carson. He looked at the screen. at the alignment, at the pattern. He understood now that the question was no longer whether the transactions had occurred. It was how they had been executed, and under what conditions. The session continued. Additional records, further alignment, no escalation, no accusation, just structure. By the time it ended, the gas station was no longer an isolated location. It was part of the system, not because of what happened there, because of when. And timing, once aligned with record, did not require interpretation. Valentina stood outside the building, the afternoon light steady and unchanging. Ethan joined her a moment later. "They've incorporated it," he said. Valentina nodded. "Yes." Ethan glanced at her. "It's a small detail," he said. Valentina looked ahead. "It's a precise one," she replied. Ethan considered that, then nodded. In systems like this, precision carried more weight than scale. A single aligned detail could shift an entire structure. Valentina adjusted her bag on her shoulder. She did not look back. There was nothing left in that direction that required her attention. The gas station remained where it had always been, unchanged. But its place in the sequence had been defined. And once defined, it would remain. The word bankruptcy did not arrive all at once. It moved through the system in stages, each one quieter than the last, each one carrying more weight than it appeared to at first glance. At Redline Freight Systems, the first indication was not a formal declaration. It was delay. Invoices that remained unpaid. Fuel contracts that required immediate confirmation, but received none. Vendors who had once responded within minutes now waited. Then followed restriction. Accounts that had already been frozen did not reopen. Temporary holds extended into indefinite reviews. Lines of credit that Carson had relied on as extensions of his authority became inaccessible. Their availability replaced by conditions he could no longer meet. By the time the term restructuring entered internal discussion, the structure itself had already shifted. Dylan saw it before anyone said it out loud. He sat at his desk reviewing the latest financial position summary, the numbers no longer abstract but immediate. Cash flow projections collapsed inward. Obligations remained fixed. There was no adjustment that could reconcile the gap. He leaned back in his chair, the realization settling not as shock but as inevitability. Across the hall, Carson remained in his office. The door was closed, the blinds partially drawn. Inside, he stood at his desk, one hand resting against its edge, the other holding his phone, as he moved through a series of calls that no longer produced results. "I need confirmation," he said into the receiver. "Not a review, a resolution." There was a pause. "I understand your position," he continued, his tone controlled but tightening. "But this delay is creating operational risk." Another pause. "No, we can't wait for the full cycle," he said. "We need access now." The call ended without agreement. Carson lowered the phone slowly. For a moment, he remained still. Then he reached for another number. The pattern repeated. Request, clarification. Delay, no resolution. The system no longer responded to urgency. It responded to process. And process did not accelerate under pressure. It continued at its own pace. Carson placed the phone down. He looked at the documents spread across his desk, financial summaries, legal notices, internal reports, each one reflecting a structure that was no longer aligned with his control. He understood now that the issue was not the freeze. It was what the freeze had revealed. The transactions, the patterns, the alignment of records. They had not created the problem. They had exposed it. Carson exhaled slowly. Then he reached for his jacket. Valentina sat in a quiet office across the city reviewing a different set of documents, not financial, legal. Ethan stood near the window, his attention divided between the file in his hand and the city beyond. "They've moved to formal proceedings," he said. Valentina looked up. Which phase? She asked. Ethan turned toward her. Pre-bankruptcy review, he replied. They're evaluating restructuring options, but the position is limited. Valentina nodded. She did not ask for detail. She understood what limited meant in this context. Ethan placed the file on the table. They've also requested your presence for a statement, he added. Valentina's expression remained unchanged. I won't be attending, she said. Ethan studied her for a moment. It could strengthen the record, he said. Valentina considered that. Then she shook her head slightly. The record is already complete, she replied. Ethan did not argue, because he knew she was right. Everything that needed to be established had been established through documentation. Presence would not alter structure, it would only add narrative. And narrative in this phase held less weight than record. Ethan nodded once. I'll inform them, he said. Valentina returned her attention to the documents. Not to review, to confirm. Everything aligned. Everything remained intact. There was nothing left to add. Carson arrived without calling ahead. The receptionist recognized him immediately, her posture shifting slightly as he approached. I'm here to see Valentina, he said. His tone was measured. Not aggressive, not urgent, controlled. The receptionist hesitated. I'll check if she's available, she said. Carson nodded. He did not sit. He remained standing. His gaze fixed ahead, his posture composed in a way that suggested intention rather than uncertainty. A moment later, Ethan appeared. Carson, he said. Carson turned toward him. Ethan, he replied. The exchange was brief, neutral. I need to speak with her, Carson said. Ethan held his gaze. She's aware you're here, he said. Carson waited. Ethan did not move immediately. Then after a measured pause, he stepped aside. She has a few minutes, he said. Carson nodded once. He moved past him. Valentina stood by the window when Carson entered. The room was quiet, minimal. Nothing in it suggested confrontation. She did not turn immediately. She allowed the moment to settle. Then she faced him. Carson took a step forward. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. Valentina, he said. Her name was spoken evenly, without accusation, without familiarity, just acknowledgement. Valentina met his gaze. Yes, she replied. There was no visible tension in her posture, no reaction beyond presence. Carson exhaled slowly. We need to talk, he said. Valentina did not move. We are, she replied. The distinction settled. Carson nodded once. He stepped closer. This has gone further than it needed to, he said. Valentina did not respond immediately. She let the statement exist. Then it followed the structure, she said. Carson's expression shifted slightly. That structure can be adjusted, he replied. Valentina shook her head almost imperceptibly. No, she said. It can't. Carson studied her. For the first time, there was no attempt to dominate the space, only calculation. This doesn't have to end this way, he said. Valentina held his gaze. It already has, she replied. The words were not sharp, they were final. Carson looked away briefly, then back. We can resolve this, he said. There are options, settlements, agreements. Valentina remained still. There are procedures, she said. Carson's jaw tightened. Procedures can be influenced, he replied. Valentina did not react. Not this one, she said. The silence that followed was different from the others. Not neutral, not tense, defined. Carson exhaled again, slower this time. You didn't have to do it this way, he said. Valentina's expression did not change. I didn't, she replied. The acknowledgement carried no defensiveness, only fact. Carson looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. a small movement, controlled, as if accepting something he could not alter. "I need time," he said. Valentina did not answer immediately. "Then you have the same amount as everyone else," she said. Carson's gaze held hers. There was nothing left to negotiate in that moment. No argument that would shift the structure already in motion. He understood that now. Not fully, but enough. He stepped back, not abruptly, deliberately. "I'll be in touch," he said. Valentina inclined her head slightly. No agreement, no objection, just acknowledgement. Carson turned and walked toward the door. He did not look back. Valentina remained where she was, still, composed. The room returned to quiet as the door closed behind him. Outside, Carson paused for a moment before continuing down the hallway. The building felt different from when he had entered. Not in appearance, in alignment. He moved toward the exit. His steps measured his expression unchanged. But internally, something had shifted. Not collapse, recognition. The system he had built was no longer responding to him, and the person he had believed he could remove from it had become the one who understood it most completely. Inside, Valentina returned her attention to the window. The city moved as it always did, unaware, unchanged. Ethan stepped back into the room. "He's gone," he said. Valentina nodded. "Yes." Ethan watched her for a moment. "You handled that?" "Cleanly," he said. Valentina did not respond, because there was nothing to handle. Everything had already been set in motion, and now it was simply continuing. There had been a time when Valentina believed endurance was temporary, that if she remained patient long enough, if she absorbed enough of the imbalance without reacting, something would correct itself. That the version of Carson she had first known, the one who asked questions, who listened, who built carefully, would reappear once the pressure eased. She had not been naive. She had been deliberate. In the early years of red-line freight systems, before the structure became visible to others, before investors, and contracts and expansion plans layered over the foundation, the company had been smaller, uncertain, dependent on precision rather than momentum. Carson had understood that then. He had needed it, and he had needed her. Valentina remembered those nights clearly. Spreadsheets open across a narrow table. Documents reviewed line by line. Projections adjusted not to impress, but to survive. Carson would speak quickly, outlining possibilities, directions, opportunities that existed just beyond reach. Valentina would listen. Then she would ask questions. Not to challenge, to clarify. What happens if the payment is delayed? She would ask. What's the fallback if the contract doesn't renew? Where does the risk sit if this projection doesn't hold? Carson had not always liked those questions, but he had answered them. Because at that stage, answers mattered more than appearance. Together, they had built something that functioned. Not perfectly, but honestly. That honesty did not disappear all at once. It shifted, gradually. With each success, the need for precision gave way to the appearance of certainty. Carson learned that confidence attracted opportunity, that decisiveness could replace explanation, that people responded to clarity even when that clarity simplified complexity. Valentina saw the shift as it happened. She did not resist it immediately, because not all change was negative. Growth required adaptation. But adaptation without structure led to something else. She recognized it in small moments first. A projection presented as fact. A delay reframed as strategy. A decision made without full consideration of its implications. Individually, each moment was manageable. Together they formed a pattern. Valentina did not confront it directly, not because she was unaware, because she was measuring. She needed to understand whether the shift was temporary or structural, whether Carson was adjusting under pressure or redefining his approach entirely. The answer revealed itself over time, not through a single action, through repetition. Carson stopped asking questions. He stopped revisiting decisions. He stopped allowing space for uncertainty. And without that space, precision had no place to exist. Valentina adjusted, not outwardly, internally. She reduced her input, observed more, recorded more, not as an act of preparation for confrontation, as a continuation of the same discipline she had always applied. If the structure was changing, she needed to understand how. And if it moved beyond correction, she needed to ensure that the truth of it remained intact. The decision to stay was not passive. It was strategic. Valentina understood that leaving too early would reduce everything she had seen to interpretation. Her observations would be dismissed as perspective. Her concerns reframed as disagreement. Without structure, truth became negotiable. She did not want negotiation. She wanted clarity. So she remained. Through the shift in tone, through the dismissal of her role, through the gradual erasure of her presence in the company she had helped build. She allowed Carson to redefine the narrative publicly, while she preserved the record privately. It was not an easy process. There were moments when leaving would have been simpler, moments when the imbalance became visible enough that silence felt like complicity. But Valentina understood the difference between reaction and resolution. Reaction changed the moment. Resolution changed the outcome. She chose outcome. The emergence of Vanessa Cole did not surprise her, not in the way it might have earlier. It fit the pattern, not as an emotional betrayal, as an extension of the same structure Carson had built in the company. Fragmentation, redirection, control through separation. Valentina did not confront Vanessa, because Vanessa was not the source. She was part of the system. Addressing her would not alter the structure, only the perception of it. Valentina was not interested in perception. She was interested in alignment. When the financial patterns became clear, the decision shifted from observation to preparation. She did not act immediately, because action without completeness would leave space for interpretation, and interpretation could be challenged, delayed, redirected. She needed the structure to be complete, not perfect, complete. That meant documenting not just the transactions, the intent behind them, the consistency of behavior, the alignment of actions across time. She waited until the pattern could not be broken by explanation, until each piece supported the next without contradiction, until the system, when viewed as a whole, could only be understood in one way. That was when she stopped adding and started preparing. The clause 14b. It had existed from the beginning, a safeguard, a contingency, a detail Carson had agreed to without assigning weight to it. Valentina had never forgotten it, not because she anticipated needing it, because she understood its purpose. It was not designed for conflict. It was designed for clarity. When she reviewed the structure one final time, she did not ask whether she should act. She asked whether the structure would hold if she did. The answer was yes. That was enough. The desert was not part of the plan, but it did not alter it. When Carson left her at the gas station, he believed he was removing her from the situation, simplifying it, reducing it to something he could manage without interference. Valentina understood the opposite. He had created separation, and separation removed the final variable. There was no longer any ambiguity about her involvement in what followed. The system would act without her presence, based solely on the record. That was what she had prepared for. The call she made that night was not driven by emotion, not by the act of being left behind. It was driven by alignment. Everything that needed to exist, existed. Everything that needed to connect, connected. The structure was complete. She activated it, not to punish, not to retaliate, to allow it to function. Valentina did not stay because she lacked the ability to leave. She stayed because leaving too early would have allowed the structure to remain hidden. She stayed until it revealed itself fully. And once it did, she left. Not in reaction. In completion, Ethan listened without interrupting. Valentina had not spoken at length before this. Not about the past, not about the decision. But now, as the process moved toward its conclusion, the context no longer altered the outcome. It clarified it. You knew where it was going, Ethan said. Valentina considered that. I knew what it was becoming, she replied. Ethan nodded, and now he asked. Valentina looked toward the window. The city remained steady, unchanged. Now it finishes, she said. There was no emotion in the statement, no relief, no regret, only recognition of sequence. The structure had been built, observed, documented, activated. And now it would conclude. Without her needing to remain inside it, the conclusion did not arrive as a single moment. It unfolded the way everything else had, through process, through documentation, through decisions made in rooms where no one raised their voice, but everything shifted. The final notice came in the form of a filing. Redline Freight Systems entered formal bankruptcy proceedings under Chapter 11. Not as a strategy for recovery, but as a necessary containment of what could no longer be sustained. The language was precise, controlled. It avoided implication. It did not assign blame. It did not need to. By the time the filing was made, the structure had already been examined from every angle that mattered. The review team had completed its analysis. The board had received its findings. The bank had documented its position. The system had aligned. The redirection of funds was no longer described as irregular. It was defined as unauthorized use of company assets under conditions that bypassed internal controls. Not an accusation, a determination. Carson received the notice in his office, not through a call, not through confrontation, through documentation. He read it once. Then again, the phrasing did not change. It did not soften. It did not escalate. It simply existed. For a moment he remained standing, the paper held in his hand, his posture unchanged. The office around him looked exactly as it had before. The desk, the glass walls, the city beyond. Nothing had shifted physically, but the alignment that had once placed him at the center of it all no longer held. He set the paper down, slowly, deliberately, not as a gesture of acceptance, as recognition. There was no immediate action to take. No call to make that would alter the outcome. No decision that would redirect the structure now in place. Carson moved to the window. He stood there for a long moment, looking out at the city he had once navigated with certainty. The movement below continued, unaware, unchanged. He did not think about the moment at the gas station, not directly, but it existed within the sequence, not as the cause, as a point of alignment. A moment where separation became absolute, where the final condition for activation had been met. Carson closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. There was nothing left to manage, only to move through what remained. Valentina received the same notice, not in person, not unexpectedly. Ethan placed the document in front of her without commentary. She read it once, carefully. Then she closed the folder. There was no visible reaction, no shift in posture, no release of tension, because there had been no tension to release. Everything that the document represented had already occurred. This was not the moment of change. It was the confirmation of it. Ethan watched her. "It's complete," he said. Valentina nodded. "Yes." There was a pause. Not waiting, not uncertain, just space. "What will you do next?" Ethan asked. Valentina considered the question. Not for long. Continue, she said. The answer was simple, but it carried weight. Not because of what it promised, because of what it did not. She did not say rebuild. She did not say recover. She did not say move on. She said continue. Because for her, the process had never been interruption. It had been sequence. Ethan nodded. That makes sense, he said. Valentina stood. She gathered her bag, not hurried, not delayed. Everything in the room remained as it was, unchanged, because nothing here needed to be taken with her. The work had been done. The structure had concluded. What remained was not something to carry. It was something to leave. The building Carson had occupied began to change. Not immediately, not visibly from the outside. But internally, the adjustments started. Meetings canceled, departments restructured, access permissions altered. The system that had once responded to his direction now responded to new inputs. Not personal, procedural. Carson moved through it without resistance. He did not argue. He did not attempt to reassert control in ways that no longer applied. He signed what needed to be signed, reviewed what required review, responded where response was still relevant. But the center had shifted, and he understood that now. Not in full, but enough. Valentina left the office without announcement. She stepped into the afternoon light, the city moving around her with the same steady rhythm it had maintained throughout everything that had happened. There were no witnesses to her departure. No one waiting. No one watching. Which was how it had always been. She moved through the street with the same composure she had maintained from the beginning. Not as someone leaving something behind, as someone stepping into what came next. Her phone remained in her bag. Silent. No messages required response, no calls to return. Because everything that had required her voice had already been spoken. Not through confrontation, through record, through structure, through alignment. She reached the corner and paused briefly as the light changed. The moment was ordinary, unremarkable, and yet it held something that had not existed before. Completion, not dramatic, not visible, but present. Valentina crossed the street. She did not look back, not because she refused to, because there was nothing left in that direction that required her attention. The gas station remained in the desert, unchanged. The company remained in process, contained. Carson remained within the system he had once controlled. But Valentina no longer occupied any part of that structure. She had stepped out of it, not in reaction, in completion. And in that completion, there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to correct, nothing left to hold. Only the continuation of a life that had always existed beyond it. The story does not end where the system closes. It lingers in what remains after the noise of process fades. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition, and it does not rush toward resolution. It observes, it records, and when the moment is right, it allows truth to stand on its own. Valentina never raised her voice. She never needed to, because she understood something that many overlook. That in a world built on appearance, the quiet persistence of fact carries a weight that cannot be negotiated. It does not bend under pressure, and it does not fade when ignored. It waits. And when it is finally seen, it does not argue. It simply exists. Carson believed control was something you could hold through force of will, through language, through certainty. But control in its truest form belongs to structure, and structure belongs to truth. What unfolded between them was not revenge. It was consequence. Not immediate, not dramatic, but complete. If you've stayed with this story until the end, you already understand that some battles are never meant to be fought out loud. Some victories are not measured by what is taken, but by what is no longer carried. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to share where you're watching from and what time it is there. There's something grounding in knowing how far stories can travel in silence. And if you want more stories that explore strength, justice, and the quiet ways truth finds its place, you're welcome to stay. Not because you have to, but because sometimes the stories we return to are the ones that remind us who we are.